This video is a review of The Flash Season 9, Episode 4, which is the penultimate episode in the Red Death arc in the final season, and the episode is titled The Mask of the Red Death Part 1. To start things off, let's quickly go over the typical complaints of The Flash since around Season 6 that do bring down the show every episode in similar ways, but it's not the same level in every episode, so it does need to be addressed. There are 5 supporting characters that pertain to this, which is just a staggering amount. The worst of these, in my opinion, is typically Cecile, who did have a larger role in this episode compared to the previous one, but her presence wasn't really as bad as it can be. There was one moment of her using her powers. The show tries to make it into feeling like a triumphant moment, but that will never not fall completely flat with this character, and there's maybe one moment or maybe 2 of her saying that a certain character is feeling a certain emotion, which is like the worst thing that this show ever does. But outside of those 1 or 2 moments, the storyline with her and Joe isn't what I would call irritating like Cecile can be. It's more so just filler and very repetitive. It feels like we've seen this before, Cecile and Joe arguing about whether or not they should leave Central City. And yeah, we have seen it before, and it feels like it just keeps on repeating it over and over again. But at the very least, Jenna West appears in this episode, which is crazy. It did seem like she got erased from existence, but lo and behold, she hasn't. I'm pretty sure she hasn't appeared since like maybe season 5, which is insane. Then there's Chester and Allegra, who occupy 2 or 3 scenes, so there are 2 or 3 very skippable scenes in this episode, which does automatically bring down the score of the episode, that's for sure, but it's the same as every other previous episode, just not that much of it, so I don't need to delve into it again. Then there's Keon, whose existence is ridiculous, being introduced in the final season as a new version of a character who's been around since the very beginning, who's unceremoniously killed off-screen, is all insane. Just the fact that she exists is like the embodiment of the mistreatment of the character of Caitlin Snow. However, beyond her existence, she's also a bit annoying. Her main trait is that she has this childlike innocence, but also everything she says is insightful and helpful and incredibly intelligent. It's getting very old, and in fact, it has gotten very old already. And finally is Chillblaine, who has finally gotten something interesting to do in the previous episode where he betrayed Barry, but then they immediately reverse that in this episode. Like, he immediately regrets it at the beginning, and you can tell, and then by the end, he's convinced he's a good guy again, which is so disheartening. Like, you couldn't stick to that. They finally did something interesting with this character, and they already reversed it. It does seem like he died in this episode, and I would hope that he is in fact dead. That would not be a terrible ending to this character, and also I don't want to see him again, but just the fact that he was up the series regular this season, and it's only been 4 episodes out of the 13, spoils, alongside the set photos, that he's alive and well. What a bummer. So yeah, basically the supporting cast of this show is terrible, and they have been terrible for a while now, but let's move past that. Let's look at the main plot and most important part of this episode, which thankfully is what it mainly focuses on, which is the Red Death, who made a big impact with the end of the last episode with the hilarious reference to the Batman with the I am vengeance moment, but this episode took it to another level. Right out of the gate, like a couple minutes in, Red Death calls criminals a superstitious and cowardly lot, which is an iconic line from Batman comics. This was a fine moment, not too big of a deal, and a nice reference to Batman. Immediately after that, however, she said, I am vengeance, I am the night, I am Red Death, which is a reference to one of the most iconic Batman lines of all time that originates in Batman the Animated Series, and that was a bit more on the nose, but still not awful, still a nice reference to another Batman media. However, I can see people cringing at that line, and I did a bit, but up until that point, I did enjoy all these references to Batman and all of his iconic lines, but they just couldn't stop there. Later on in the episode, when Red Death visits Iris and starts to reveal herself as the Red Death and she starts to suit up, she says, "You wanna get nuts, let's get nuts," which is an iconic but also kind of ridiculous line from the 1989 Michael Keaton Batman movie. And this moment I cringed at and I laughed. I couldn't help but laugh. It was a funny moment that was clearly not meant to be funny. It felt very out of place and didn't feel like something she would actually say, just a reference from another thing. And even in like the 1989 Batman movie, it felt out of place. Like, what is he saying? Is he trying to get shot? I enjoy these references, and in fact my channel started off with Arrowverse Batman references, but this one in particular was hilarious, and I couldn't take Red Death seriously after that point, which I am aware is way later than most other people. Up until that point, Red Death had her moments. Like, I like the conversations with Barry, and even when she removed her mask and it turns out it's just the suit, it looks goofy, but that's fine. And even without her mask, as she's trying to trick Iris, I like those scenes. Like, it felt a bit ominous and slightly scary. However, it felt like there was a shift after the moment where she said that line, where Red Death became much goofier and much more cartoony, and the acting from the actress, I think it's pronounced Javicia Leslie, was good in the scenes with Iris, but at the end, where she was trying to convey her anger and frustration towards the Flash and the failure of her plan, the acting was, that was bad. You don't want to use a different take, maybe? I mean, oof, that was hard to watch. It was like a little kid throwing a tantrum. It was awful. Also, this episode attempts to explain Red Death's origin, but in doing so breaks the cardinal rule of storytelling, which is show, don't tell. Everything we learn is just told to us when she told Iris, but we didn't get to see any of it. Imagine how much more interesting this episode and Red Death as a villain would have been if instead of the scenes of her telling us her origin, and then also instead of all the scenes of Cecile, Chester, and Allegra, we could see actual scenes in her timeline. Maybe it's the continuation of the Armageddon timeline, maybe it's just an alternate universe, and in those scenes we would see her origin story and how she got to the point where she is now, but alas, we were not shown anything, and honestly, even if they do show something in the next episode, just the fact that she's going to be defeated in that same episode will lessen the impact of it being shown here in the penultimate episode, which would have worked really, really well. Instead, we were just told, which is just a much less interesting way to convey information to the audience. It's just exposition. And speaking of show don't tell, this episode and the rest of the season have been doing the opposite, which has reached a boiling point for me. I am so sick of it, which is that they should only tell, but they do show, with any callback to a previous episode or a previous season. They always make that callback, but then actually show the moment happening in a flashback, which is insulting to the audience, as it's assumed they either don't remember that happened or they didn't even watch it, which also shows such a low confidence in the showrunners and the people making the show that people actually remember their show, that it's memorable. There's this one moment in this episode as well, in the beginning, where Iris and Barry are talking about everything they learned in the previous episode in regards to the weapons of the Rogues and Ryan Wilder and Wayne Industries, all of it, which gives off this vibe that they just think that you didn't watch the previous episode or you don't remember it, which again, it's insulting to the audience and it shows such a low confidence, and it's reached a boiling point. It's been happening every episode this season and it's infuriating. It's like Cecile telling the audience how they feel levels of infuriating and insulting to the audience. I do think this episode was very up and down. Red Death had her moments and was ramping up to be at the very least a decent villain, or maybe I would say at the very most, but not only was she let down by her backstory not being shown on screen, but also there felt like there was a cutoff point in the episode where Red Death went from being a decent villain to a much more goofy and poorly acted version of that same villain, which was like in the last third or so of the episode. The episode also has moments of Chester and Allegra and Cecile and Keon that are all either skippable or actively infuriating, plus it pussies out of actually letting Chillblaine become a villain again, which was the first time he did something interesting like ever. I will say this episode doesn't look terrible visually. It doesn't look great either. It is definitely very dark, but it looks like they put a little bit more effort into the cinematography. That's just to say it doesn't look like an episode of Power Rangers, but that can't save the episode from being painfully mediocre, even for the Flash's standards, so I'll give it a 5 out of 10 and hope that the next episode sticks the landing. Otherwise, this arc will be more mediocre than it is good.